On the night when everything hurt too much, a child wrote with trembling fingers and fading hope. The message, sent by mistake, reached someone who had once waited for help too. He didn't hesitate, didn't question it. He just went, determined to change a destiny he recognized. The rain beat against the windows of the small house on the outskirts of Queens, New York, with a violence that mirrored the terror gripping the room inside. 7-year-old Isabella cowered behind the worn-out living room sofa, her brown eyes wide with fear as she watched the scene unfolding before her. The smell of alcohol saturated the air, mixed with the scent of burnt chili from the kitchen, creating a suffocating atmosphere that seemed to suck all the oxygen from the room. Roberto, her stepfather, who had come home drunk yet again, paced back and forth like a caged animal. His words were slurred and aggressive, loaded with a rage that grew by the minute. Carmen, Isabella's mother, tried to stay calm, her hands trembling as she clutched a damp dish towel, as if the object could offer some protection against the coming storm. "You've done nothing all day, Carmen," Roberto yelled, his red face twisted in fury. "The house is a pigsty, there's no decent food, and you still have the nerve to question me when I get home." Isabella knew that tone of voice all too well. It was the same one that preceded the worst nights when the yelling turned into something much more terrifying. The little girl clutched an old cracked cell phone she had secretly taken from her mother's purse, her small fingers shaking so badly she could barely hold it. At school, her teacher, Ms. Davis, always talked about asking for help when you needed it, but Isabella never knew who to ask. "Roberto, please, Isabella's right here," Carmen whispered, trying to shield her daughter with soft words. "Let's talk in the kitchen, away from her." The response came as a violent shove that sent Carmen stumbling, forcing her to grab the living room table to keep from falling completely. The sound of plates crashing to the floor echoed through the house like a harbinger of what was to come. Isabella bit her lip to stifle a scream, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. "Don't tell me what to do in my own house." Roberto advanced again, this time grabbing Carmen by the arm with a force that made the woman groan in pain. It was always like this. The violence started with shoves, escalated to painful grips, and ended in a way Isabella preferred to forget. The girl had learned to recognize the signs, to hide at the right moment, to pretend she was asleep when the screams got too loud. But tonight was different. There was something in Roberto's eyes that scared her more than usual. "You think you can live here for free?" His voice grew deeper, more dangerous with every word. "Who do you think you are?" Carmen tried to pull away, but Roberto yanked her harder, causing her to lose her balance completely. What happened next unfolded so quickly that Isabella could barely process it. Carmen fell, trying to shield herself with her arms, but Roberto followed her down, consumed by a rage that seemed to have a life of its own. The sound Isabella heard was something that would be seared into her memory forever, a sharp crack, followed by a scream of pain that cut through the air like a blade. Carmen lay motionless on the floor, breathing heavily, her left arm bent at an impossible angle. "Mommy?" Isabella scrambled out from her hiding place without thinking, her small legs carrying her toward her mother. Roberto turned to her, his eyes bloodshot. "Get back where you were, you little brat. This is none of your business." But Isabella didn't listen. She knelt beside Carmen, who was conscious but clearly in shock, silent tears streaming down her face. Her arm was visibly broken, and every attempt to move brought a fresh wave of agony. "It hurts so much, Mommy," Isabella whispered, her voice breaking. Carmen tried to smile to reassure her daughter, but the pain was too intense. "It's okay, sweetie. It'll be okay." Roberto continued to pace the living room, seemingly surprised by his own violence, muttering incomprehensible things under his breath. He would occasionally glance at Carmen on the floor, and Isabella kneeling beside her, but he showed no remorse, only a growing irritation. Isabella remembered the phone she was still clutching. At school, Ms. Davis had shown them a safety pamphlet that mentioned emergency numbers. The girl tried to remember the right one, but panic made everything a blur. Her hands were shaking so much she could barely see the numbers on the cracked screen. With her heart racing, Isabella typed a short, desperate message. "Please help. He broke my mum's arm and she's on the floor. I'm so scared." Unable to think clearly about what number to dial, the girl vaguely remembered seeing someone jot down some digits in her mother's address book. She copied the numbers as she recalled them, but her haste and nerves made her mix up a few digits. She didn't know who she was sending it to, or if anyone would even receive it. She just knew she had to try. With fingers cold from fear, she pressed send. The message was dispatched to a number Isabella had never seen before, carrying with it all the desperation of a child who no longer knew what to do to protect the most important person in her life. Across the city, in a sleek office, a cell phone vibrated discreetly on a mahogany desk, about to connect two worlds that should never have met. Edward Mendoza was alone in his private office on the top floor of a commercial high-rise in Midtown Manhattan. The city lights spread out like diamonds through the floor-to-ceiling windows, creating a stark contrast with the absolute silence that filled the room. At 42, Edward had built a financial empire that allowed him to live isolated from the world, just the way he preferred. His nightly routine was always the same: review reports, analyze investments, and organize the next day's schedule. Work was his only constant companion, a deliberate choice made by someone who had learned early on that trusting people was far too dangerous. The office walls were decorated with expensive but completely impersonal abstract paintings, like everything else in Edward's life. The cell phone vibrated discreetly on the mahogany desk, breaking his concentration on a financial report. Edward glanced at the screen with irritation. Messages from unknown numbers were always blocked by his virtual assistant, but somehow this one had slipped through the filter. "Please, help. He broke my mom's arm and she's on the floor. I'm so scared." Edward read the message once, then again. His fingers tightened involuntarily around the phone, and something deep in his chest clenched in a way he hadn't felt in decades. Those simple, desperate words awakened memories he had meticulously buried over the years. Suddenly, Edward was no longer in his elegant office. He was 8 years old, hiding under the bed in a small, dark room in a house on the outskirts of Newark. He could hear his mother, Elena's screams, and the drunken voice of his biological father echoing through the house. "Please don't hurt her," little Edward would whisper to no one, pressing his hands over his ears to muffle the sounds that haunted him night after night. He remembered the smell of cheap alcohol that clung to his father's clothes, the mornings he found Elena trying to hide bruises with makeup, the forced smiles she offered when he asked if she was okay. Edward especially remembered one night when Elena fell down the stairs after being pushed, and how he, a small, terrified child, hadn't known what to do to help her. Never again, Edward had sworn to himself when he grew up and managed to get his mother out of that situation. "I will never let this happen to anyone again." But that promise had been lost in corporate responsibilities, empty social engagements, and the construction of a life where personal problems had no place. Edward had become the very type of person who would ignore a cry for help, someone shielded by wealth and power, unable to connect with the suffering of others. Until that message arrived. Edward shot up from his chair, knocking over the Italian leather seat in the process. He walked to the window, looking out at the city that stretched below him like a conquered territory. His reflection in the glass showed a tall man with dark hair combed with precision, wearing a suit that cost more than many people earned in months. But for a moment, all Edward could see was the scared little boy he had once been. He picked up the phone again and reread the message. The number wasn't saved in his contacts, and there was no information about the exact location. Edward activated his technological resources, expensive programs that could trace the message's origin. Within minutes, he had an approximate address, a neighborhood in Queens, an area Edward knew only from the socio-economic reports that crossed his desk. Meanwhile, in the small house where Isabella and Carmen were trying to survive the most terrifying night of their lives, the situation continued to deteriorate. Roberto had found a bottle of cheap whiskey hidden behind the refrigerator and was drinking straight from the neck, his movements becoming more erratic and unpredictable. Carmen remained on the living room floor, trying not to move so as not to worsen the pain in her broken arm. Isabella stayed by her side, whispering words of comfort she had learned from her mother, consoling her during nightmares. The role reversal was painful to witness, a 7-year-old child trying to care for her injured mother while the abuser remained a constant threat. "Mommy, someone's going to come help us," Isabella murmured, not sure if she believed her own words. I sent a message. Carmen tried to smile, but the pain was too intense. Who did you send it to, sweetie? I don't know, Isabella admitted, her tears dripping onto the floor next to her mother's face. I just copied some numbers I saw in your address book. The cracked cell phone lay silent beside them, with no sign of a response. Isabella was beginning to realize that maybe no one was coming, that she and her mother would have to face this night alone, just like all the others. Roberto approached again, staggering slightly. Are you two still there? His voice was thicker now, but the aggression remained. Carmen, get up off the damn floor. You're being dramatic. Roberto, I think my arm is really broken, Carmen managed to say, trying to remain calm. I need to go to the hospital. To hell with the hospital, Roberto exploded, kicking a nearby chair. You're staying right here and cutting the crap. Isabella instinctively placed herself between Roberto and her mother, even though she was too small to offer any real protection. This act of desperate courage made Roberto laugh in a cruel way that sent a chill down the little girl's spine. Well, look at that. The little brat wants to play tough, he sneered, crouching down to Isabella's level. The smell of alcohol on his breath was nauseating. You want to learn a lesson too, kid? The fear Isabella felt in that moment was unlike anything she had ever experienced. It wasn't just terror for what might happen to her, but the awful realization that if something happened to her, Carmen would be left completely alone and defenseless. Back in his office, Edward had put on his coat and was heading for the private elevator. His decision had been instinctive, driven by an urgency he hadn't felt in decades. The approximate address was noted on his phone, and Edward had cancelled all his appointments for the following morning. His private driver, Carlos, had been summoned on an emergency basis and was waiting in the building's underground garage with the car running. Edward rarely left home after 8 p.m., and never for the outer boroughs. Carlos was visibly confused, but he had known his boss long enough to know not to ask questions. Where to, Mr. Mendoza? Carlos asked, as Edward got into the back of the black sedan. Edward gave him the address, feeling a strange mix of determination and anxiety. And Carlos, we need to get there as fast as possible. As the car cut through the streets of New York toward Queens, Edward felt the weight of every passing minute. He didn't know exactly what he would find when he arrived, or if he would even be able to locate the right house. But for the first time in years, he couldn't simply ignore someone else's suffering. The rain continued to fall heavily, turning the streets into mirrors that reflected the city lights. Edward watched the urban landscape gradually change as they moved away from the financial district, the glass skyscrapers giving way to simpler buildings, the well-lit streets becoming darker and more deserted. In Isabella's house, Roberto had decided that the two of them on the living room floor were interfering with his plans to continue drinking in peace. With a casual cruelty that characterized his worst moments, he grabbed Carmen by her good arm and tried to force her to her feet. The scream of agony that escaped Carmen's lips echoed through the house and reached the ears of the neighbors, who were long accustomed to pretending they heard nothing. Isabella became completely frantic, seeing her mother hurt even more, and without thinking of the consequences, she started beating on Roberto's arms with her small fists. "Stop, you're hurting her." What Roberto did next crossed a line he had never crossed before. Roberto raised his right hand, preparing to strike Isabella with a violence the child had never faced directly. His rage-filled eyes focused on the little girl's terrified face, who flinched instinctively but refused to move away from her mother. Carmen tried to scream, but the pain in her broken arm made the sound muffled and desperate. At that exact moment, as Roberto's hand began its descent toward Isabella, a loud, determined knock echoed from the front door. It wasn't the polite knock of someone asking for permission to enter, but the authoritative sound of someone who expected to be answered immediately. Roberto froze, his hand still suspended in the air. "Who the hell is knocking at this hour?" he grumbled, looking at the door as if it could give him an answer. The rain continued to pour outside, muffling other street sounds. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Roberto lowered his arm and staggered to the entrance, clearly annoyed by the interruption. Carmen seized the moment to pull Isabella closer, ignoring the searing pain the movement caused. "Who is it?" Roberto yelled through the door without opening it. "Open the door," came the reply from the other side. The voice was calm but carried a natural authority that made Roberto hesitate. It wasn't the voice of a curious neighbor or someone who could be easily intimidated. Edward stood in the torrential rain, completely soaked but impassive. His expensive suit was ruined, but he didn't seem to care in the slightest. He had located the house using the approximate address and the screams he could hear even from inside the car. Carlos had remained in the vehicle, clearly nervous about the unusual situation. After a few seconds of tense silence, Roberto finally opened the door, revealing his staggering, hostile figure. When his eyes met Edward's, something in his posture instantly changed. The man before him was tall, imposing, and carried a presence that Roberto, even drunk, recognized as dangerous. "What do you want here?" Roberto tried to sound aggressive, but his voice came out less convincing than he intended. Edward didn't answer right away. His eyes scanned the room behind Roberto, quickly taking in the scene, the disheveled living room, the broken plates on the floor, and most importantly, Carmen and Isabella in the corner, clearly terrified. Carmen's arm was visibly deformed, and Isabella was still trembling with fear. "I received a message," Edward said finally, his voice low but clear. "A child asking for help." Roberto looked at Isabella with renewed anger, immediately realizing what had happened. "The little brat had no right to bother anyone. This is a family matter." "This doesn't look like a family matter to me," Edward replied, taking a step forward. His physical presence was intimidating, without being aggressive. There was something in his posture that communicated absolute power and determination. "Listen here, rich boy." Roberto tried to regain his authority, but Edward simply ignored him, walking into the house uninvited. Roberto stood, frozen in the doorway, momentarily confused about how to react to the stranger's audacity. Edward approached Carmen and Isabella with careful movements, like someone trying not to frighten wounded animals. He knelt beside them, his gaze immediately focusing on Carmen's broken arm. "My name is Edward," he said softly, addressing Isabella first. "You were very brave to ask for help." Isabella looked at this strange man with a mixture of hope and suspicion. Her childish instincts, honed by years of fear, tried to gauge whether he represented a new threat or, finally, the salvation she had prayed for. "You got my message?" Isabella whispered, her voice barely audible. "I did," Edward confirmed, then turned to Carmen. "We need to get you to a hospital immediately. That arm needs medical attention." Carmen tried to speak, but the words came out choked with pain. I don't have money for a hospital." "That's not a concern right now," Edward said firmly. "The important thing is to take care of you." Roberto, who had been watching the scene with growing indignation, finally exploded. "Hey, who do you think you are, coming into my house and giving orders?" Edward rose slowly, turning to face Roberto. The difference between the two men was stark. Edward, though wet and in a ruined suit, radiated control and power, while Roberto swayed slightly, diminished by alcohol and his own cowardice. "Your house?" Edward repeated, his voice laced with contempt. "This is the house where you break a defenseless woman's arm and terrorize a child?" "You don't understand the situation," Roberto retorted, but there was less conviction in his voice. "They provoked me. Carmen disrespected me." "There is no provocation that justifies this," Edward said, gesturing toward the injured Carmen. "And there is definitely no justification for threatening a child." Isabella watched the exchange between the two men with fascination. She had never seen anyone confront Roberto like that. Usually, adults pretended not to see, not to hear, not to know what happened inside that house. But this strange man was here, defending her and her mother as if it were his duty. Roberto took a few steps toward Edward, trying to use his height to intimidate him. "You need to get out of my house now before I call the police." Edward didn't back down an inch. "Go ahead. They'll be very interested to hear how Carmen broke her arm." The implied threat in Edward's words had the desired effect. Roberto knew his version of events wouldn't hold up under investigation, especially if there were witnesses willing to talk. His aggression began to morph into nervousness. "Look, man," Roberto tried a different approach, forcing a more conciliatory tone. Maybe things got out of hand, but this is none of your business. Carmen is my woman, Isabella is practically my daughter. I take care of them. This is your way of taking care of them? Edward asked, pointing again to Carmen on the floor. While the two men talked, Carmen tried to focus on breathing through the pain. Isabella remained glued to her side, but now she watched Edward with growing hope. There was something in the way he spoke, in the way he positioned himself between them and Roberto, that made her feel protected for the first time in a long time. Edward took his phone out of his pocket and started dialing. "I'm calling an ambulance," he announced. "No!" Roberto practically yelled. "We don't need that. Carmen's fine." "She is clearly not fine," Edward replied, completing the call. He spoke briefly with the dispatcher, providing the address and a concise description of the medical situation. Roberto realized he was losing control of the situation. The alcohol that had fueled his courage was now making it harder to think clearly. The presence of this strange man had completely changed the dynamic of the house, turning Roberto from aggressor to suspect. "Carmen." Roberto tried to approach her, but Edward immediately blocked his path. "I think you should keep your distance," Edward said calmly, but his posture made it clear it wasn't a request. "She's my woman," Roberto protested. "And she's hurt because of you," Edward responded without hesitation. Isabella surprised everyone by speaking for the first time since Edward's arrival. "He's not my dad, and he always hurts my mommy." The child's words fell into the room like a final indictment. Roberto looked at Isabella with a mixture of anger and betrayal, as if she had broken some secret pact of silence. "Isabella," Carmen whispered, trying to protect her daughter even in her vulnerable state. "It's okay," Edward said, addressing both Carmen and Isabella. "You're both safe now." The sound of an approaching ambulance siren began to cut through the noise of the rain. Roberto looked out the window with growing panic, realizing that the consequences of his actions were finally arriving. "When the paramedics get here," Edward instructed Carmen, "tell them exactly how you got hurt. Don't lie to protect anyone." Carmen nodded weakly, tears of relief mixed with pain streaming down her face. For the first time that night, she began to believe they might actually survive this nightmare. But Roberto wasn't finished yet. As the siren grew louder, indicating the ambulance was almost there, he made one last desperate attempt to regain control. Roberto lunged for the door, trying to lock it before the ambulance arrived. His movements were uncoordinated from the alcohol, but the urgency of desperation gave him a wild energy. Edward, sensing his intention, intercepted him with a quick, precise movement, blocking his path. "Get your hands off me!" Roberto yelled, shoving Edward hard. "This is my house. I decide who comes in and who goes out." Edward didn't react to the physical provocation, but his stance became even more intimidating. "The ambulance is coming in. Carmen needs medical care." "You don't get it." Roberto was clearly panicking now. "If they take her to the hospital, they'll ask questions. They'll call social services. They'll try to break up our family." Isabella, still kneeling beside her mother, watched the scene with a mix of fear and hope. Part of her was afraid Roberto would manage to kick this strange man out and everything would go back to the terrible normal. But another part, for the first time in her life, dared to imagine that things could be different. Carmen tried to move, wanting to say something, but the pain in her arm made her groan loudly. The sound cut through the argument between the two men, reminding them that there was a seriously injured woman who needed immediate attention. The siren stopped outside, and the sound of vehicle doors slamming echoed through the rain. Hurried footsteps approached the front of the house. "Please," Roberto suddenly begged, his aggression turning into pathetic desperation. "I can explain everything. Carmen fell down the stairs. It was an accident. Isabella was asleep. She didn't see anything. Right, Carmen?" Carmen looked at Roberto, then at Edward, then at Isabella. Her eyes were filled with tears, but for the first time in years they weren't just tears of physical pain. They were the tears of someone who was finally seeing a way out. "Mommy," Isabella whispered, taking Carmen's good hand, "you can tell the truth now. That man came to help us." The knock on the door repeated, this time accompanied by a professional voice. "Emergency services. Open the door." Edward walked to the entrance, completely ignoring Roberto, and opened the door. 2 paramedics entered, carrying medical equipment and moving with the efficiency of people who deal with emergencies daily. "Where's the patient?" the first paramedic asked, glancing around the messy room. Edward pointed to Carmen on the floor. "Over there. Suspected fracture of the left arm. She's conscious, but clearly in shock." The paramedics quickly approached Carmen, immediately beginning their assessment. Isabella moved aside to give them space, but remained close, tightly clutching the cracked cell phone she had used to call for help. "My name is Mark," the more experienced paramedic said to Carmen as he carefully examined her arm. "Can you tell me how this happened?" Carmen hesitated, her eyes automatically darting to Roberto, who was standing in the corner of the room, clearly agitated. The habit of protecting him even after everything was still strong. I fell," Carmen began, but her voice was weak and unconvincing. Isabella couldn't stay silent. "It wasn't a fall. Roberto pushed her and broke Mommy's arm." The silence that followed was tense and heavy. The paramedics exchanged a meaningful look, while Roberto turned pale. Edward discreetly positioned himself between Roberto and the rest of the group. "Isabella!" Carmen tried to protest, but the pain and exhaustion made it hard to keep up the charade. Mark, the paramedic, had seen similar situations many times. With professional kindness, he addressed Carmen. "Ma'am, it's important that you tell us the truth about how you were injured. It will help with your treatment." Roberto stepped forward, trying to intervene. "She's confused because of the pain. It was a simple household accident." "Sir," Edward said firmly, his voice carrying an authority that made Roberto stop in his tracks, "I think it's best if you keep quiet now." The second paramedic was preparing a portable stretcher, while Mark continued his preliminary exam. "We're going to have to take her to the hospital. This fracture will likely require surgery." "Surgery?" Carmen looked terrified. I don't have insurance. I can't afford—" "I'll cover the costs," Edward said immediately, pulling a leather wallet from the inner pocket of his wetsuit jacket. "Take her to the best hospital in the area." Roberto exploded. "You can't decide that. She's my woman. I decide where she gets treated." "Actually," Mark intervened diplomatically, "in cases of serious injury, the patient has the right to choose her care. And considering the suspicious nature of the injury, we may need to involve the authorities." The word authorities had the effect of a bomb in the room. Roberto grew even paler, while Carmen closed her eyes, likely imagining the complications to come. Edward knelt beside Carmen again. "You don't have to be afraid. Not of medical costs, not of consequences. Isabella was brave to ask for help, and now you both have support." "Why are you doing this?" Carmen asked in a weak voice. "You don't even know us." Edward hesitated for a moment, his own painful memories surfacing. "Because I know what it's like to grow up in a house where no one comes when you call for help." Isabella looked at Edward with new eyes. There was something in his voice, an old sadness she recognized because it was similar to her own pain. Mark and his colleague finished stabilizing Carmen on the stretcher. "We're heading to Mount Sinai. It's the closest and has an orthopedist on call." "I'm going with you," Isabella announced, trying to climb onto the stretcher next to her mother. "Sweetie, you'll have to come in the car," Mark explained gently. "There's no room for family in the ambulance." "I can take her," Edward offered. "My driver is waiting outside." Roberto, realizing he was completely losing control of the situation, made one last desperate attempt. "Isabella isn't going anywhere without my permission. I'm responsible for her." "You're not my dad," Isabella yelled, surprising everyone with the force in her voice. "And you never really took care of me. You just hurt Mommy and made me scared." Isabella's words echoed through the room like a final declaration. Carmen, even in her fragile state, looked at her daughter with a mixture of pride and concern. Edward turned to Roberto with an expression that brooked no argument. "Isabella is coming with me to the hospital. If you try to stop us, it will be a much bigger problem than it already is." Roberto knew he had lost. His authority, built on fear and intimidation, had completely crumbled in the presence of someone who refused to be intimidated. He sank into a chair, running his hands over his face in despair. The paramedics began to move Carmen toward the door. Isabella took her mother's good hand. "I'll be right behind you, Mommy. That man is going to take me." "Edward," he said softly. "My name is Edward." "Thank you, Mr. Edward," Isabella said with the formality of a well-mannered child, even amidst the chaos. As the stretcher was loaded into the ambulance, Edward prepared to accompany Isabella. But Roberto still had one last card to play. "Edward!" Roberto yelled as he was almost out the door. "You think you're some kind of hero, but you don't know anything. Carmen isn't the saint you think she is. And Isabella isn't whose daughter you think she is." Edward stopped without turning around. "That doesn't change anything that happened here tonight." "Doesn't it?" Roberto laughed bitterly. "When you find out the whole truth about this family, you'll realize you've gotten yourself into something much more complicated than you imagine." Isabella was confused by Roberto's words, looking back and forth between him and Edward. Were there secrets she didn't know? Things about her own family that could change everything? Edward finally turned, his eyes meeting Roberto's. "Whatever the truth is, nothing justifies what you did. Nothing." But Roberto's words had planted a seed of doubt that would grow in the coming days, complicating an already delicate situation. As Edward and Isabella left the house toward the car where Carlos was waiting, neither of them could imagine how deep the secrets they were about to uncover truly were. Mount Sinai Hospital was bustling even at that late hour. Edward held Isabella's hand as they walked through the corridors, lit by cold fluorescent lights that contrasted sharply with the grim environment they had just left. The little girl looked around with wide eyes, having never been in such a large, modern, private hospital. Carlos had stayed in the parking garage with instructions to wait, while Edward handled the administrative procedures. At the reception desk, the attendant, a middle-aged blonde woman named Sandra, looked curiously at the elegant man, even in his wetsuit, accompanied by a visibly shaken child. "Carmen Miller was brought in by ambulance a few minutes ago," Edward explained. "Arm fracture. I'm responsible for the treatment costs." "And your relationship to the patient?" Sandra asked. "Following protocol." Edward hesitated. It was a good question. "I'm a friend of the family. Isabella is her daughter." Isabella looked up at Edward, still processing how a complete stranger had suddenly become the only adult she could trust. There was something comforting in the way he spoke, in the way he stood slightly in front of her, as if shielding her from some invisible danger. "I'll need some paperwork," Sandra continued, but her expression softened as she noticed Isabella's emotional state. "Where is the child's father?" Edward searched for the right words. "He's the one who caused her mother's injuries." The meaning of his words was immediately clear. Sandra had worked in hospital reception long enough to recognize cases of domestic violence. Her expression became more serious and professional. "I see. I'll note the information and forward it to the hospital's social worker. Dr. Harrison is attending to the patient in the operating room." While Edward took care of the paperwork, Isabella sat in a blue plastic chair in the waiting room. Her legs dangled in the air, not reaching the floor, and she still clutched the cracked cell phone like a talisman. She watched people pass by, doctors in white coats, nurses carrying medications, worried families waiting for news. "Isabella," Edward said, sitting down next to her after finishing with the documentation. "Are you hungry? Thirsty? Do you need anything?" The girl shook her head, but her stomach rumbled, betraying her words. Edward smiled gently. "When was the last time you ate?" Isabella thought for a moment. "Yesterday morning, I think. Mommy made oatmeal, but then Roberto came home angry and we—" She trailed off, realizing she was sharing very personal things with a stranger. Edward's heart ached. "I'll go get you something to eat." "I won't. Leave the hospital, I promise." "You'll come back?" Isabella asked with a vulnerability that broke something inside Edward. "I'll come back," he assured her. "I won't leave you alone." Edward found a sandwich machine at the end of the hall. As he selected options a child might like, he was approached by a grey-haired woman in a lab coat with an ID that read, "Dr. Patricia Cole, social worker." "Mr. Edward Mendoza?" she asked, consulting a clipboard. "My name is Patricia. I need to speak with you about Isabella Miller." Edward felt a knot in his stomach. Is there a problem? It's standard procedure in cases like this. A minor in a high-risk situation needs to be evaluated. I understand there was domestic violence involving the mother. Edward briefly explained the night's events, omitting only the detail that he had received the message by mistake. Dr. Cole listened attentively, making occasional notes. "And what exactly is your relationship to the family?" she asked, the same question that had come up at reception. Edward realized he was on tricky ground. I met Carmen through a mutual acquaintance. When I learned of the situation, I offered to help. It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Dr. Cole seemed to sense there was more to the story, but didn't press the issue at that moment. Isabella will need to stay with someone while her mother is hospitalized. We have to determine if it's safe for her to return home, or if we need a temporary solution. Roberto is still at the house, Edward said immediately. It is definitely not safe. Are there other relatives? Grandparents, aunts, uncles? Edward realized he knew nothing about Isabella's extended family. I'd have to ask her. Please do. And Mr. Mendoza, thank you for what you did tonight. If you hadn't shown up, the situation could have become much worse. Edward returned to Isabella with sandwiches and an apple juice. She ate silently, clearly famished, but her eyes remained fixed on the hallway where Carmen had disappeared. Isabella, Edward said softly, Dr. Cole wants to know if you have any other family, grandparents, aunts, uncles, anyone you could stay with while your mom recovers. Isabella shook her head. Grandma Lucy passed away. She used to take care of me before Roberto showed up. I don't have anyone else. And your father? Edward asked carefully. Isabella was silent for a long moment, chewing slowly. I don't have a dad. At least not one that I know. Edward felt a pang of recognition. His own childhood had been marked by a father's absence, though for different reasons. Your mother never talked about him. Sometimes she gets sad and says he was a good man, but that he had to leave before I was born. She never really explains. Isabella finished her sandwich and looked at Edward with childish curiosity. Mr. Edward, why did you come help us? Roberto said some weird things. Edward chose his words carefully. When I was your age, I also went through some difficult times at home. No one came to help me back then. When I got your message, I couldn't let the same thing happen to you. But you didn't even know if the message was real, Isabella observed with a surprising astuteness for a 7-year-old. Sometimes you just know in your heart when someone needs help, Edward replied, surprised by his own honesty. 2 hours later, Dr. Harrison, a bald man with glasses who seemed extremely competent, appeared in the waiting room. Edward and Isabella stood up, immediately. The surgery was successful, he announced with a reassuring smile. We were able to realign the bones and set the fracture with metal plates. Carmen will need a few weeks of recovery, but she shouldn't have any permanent damage. Isabella sobbed with relief, and Edward instinctively placed a hand on her shoulder to comfort her. When can we see her? Edward asked. She's in recovery now, but she should be waking up from the anesthesia in the next few hours. You can visit her briefly in the morning. In the morning? Isabella looked visibly distressed. I can't stay with her? Dr. Harrison gently explained that post-op patients needed rest and that children couldn't stay overnight at the hospital. Dr. Cole appeared again, clearly prepared to address the issue of temporary shelter for Isabella. Mr. Mendoza, she began, we've managed to contact social services. There's a temporary shelter where Isabella can stay tonight. No! Isabella clung to Edward's arm with surprising strength. I don't want to go to a strange place, please. Edward looked at the desperate child clinging to his arm, then at Dr. Cole. A decision formed in his mind before he could rationally question it. What if she stayed with me tonight? Edward suggested. I have a large apartment, reliable staff. I can guarantee she'll be safe and back here first thing in the morning. Dr. Cole frowned. Mr. Mendoza, that's highly irregular. We don't normally allow children to stay with non-relatives, especially in cases like this. But there are exceptions, right? In special circumstances? Isabella looked between the two adults with growing panic. The idea of being separated from both her mother and the only adult who had shown her kindness was terrifying. Dr. Cole sighed. "I'll need to run some checks, a background check, references. And Isabella would have to agree." "I agree," Isabella said immediately. "Please, I don't want to go anywhere else." "Very well," Dr. Cole finally relented. "But it will be for tonight only, and on the condition that you bring Isabella back first thing in the morning." Edward nodded, feeling the weight of the responsibility he had just taken on. He wasn't prepared to care for a child, especially one who had just been through a trauma. But looking at Isabella clinging to his arm, he knew he couldn't just abandon her to the system. As they walked to the parking garage, Isabella asked shyly, "Mr. Edward, is there a place for me to sleep at your house?" "There is," Edward assured her. "There's a guest room you can use." What Edward didn't know was that his decision to take Isabella home that night would change both of their lives in ways neither of them could predict. And he also didn't know that Roberto, alone in the empty house, was making calls to people who could drastically complicate the situation Edward thought he was resolving. Edward's apartment took up the entire 15th floor of a residential building in Midtown, with a panoramic view of the New York City skyline. Isabella stepped out of the private elevator, timidly holding Edward's hand, her eyes widening at the sight of the marble-floored entryway and a crystal chandelier that was worth more than Roberto made in years. "Wow," she whispered, her voice echoing in the vast space. "This is where you live?" Edward saw his own home through Isabella's eyes and felt a strange pang of embarrassment. The expensive, minimalist decor he had always considered elegant now seemed cold and impersonal. There was nothing there to indicate that a human being actually lived in the space. No personal photos, no sentimental objects, no signs of real life. "It is," Edward replied, turning on the living room lights. "Are you thirsty? Still hungry?" Isabella shook her head, but her small footsteps echoed on the marble floor as she cautiously explored the room. She stopped in front of one of the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city lights spread out as far as the eye could see. "You can see everything from up here," she commented, pressing her nose against the glass. "It looks like a movie." Just then, Mrs. Miller appeared from the kitchen. Edward's housekeeper of over 10 years was a sturdy woman in her 60s, with grey hair tied in a bun and a perpetually serious expression. She stopped abruptly when she saw the child in the living room. "Mr. Mendoza?" Mrs. Miller looked back and forth between him and Isabella with obvious confusion. "I didn't know you were expecting company." "Mrs. Miller, this is Isabella. She'll be staying with us tonight." Edward realized how strange his words sounded. In 10 years, he had never brought a child home. Mrs. Miller frowned, clearly bewildered. "A child, sir, but we have nothing prepared for a child. There's no suitable food, no clothes." Isabella shrank back slightly, sensing her presence was causing discomfort. Edward noticed her reaction and immediately knelt to her level. "Isabella, how about Mrs. Miller shows you the guest room? You can take a warm shower, and then we'll find some clean clothes for you." "But Mr. Mendoza," Mrs. Miller insisted, "the girl will need children's clothes, proper toiletries. We don't have any of that." Edward turned to his housekeeper with a firmness she rarely saw. "Then we'll improvise. It's just for one night, Mrs. Miller. Isabella has been through something very difficult today." The change in Edward's tone made Mrs. Miller realize something serious was happening. Her expression softened as she looked more closely at Isabella, noticing her tear-swollen eyes and wrinkled clothes. "Of course, Mr. Mendoza." "Come along, dear." Mrs. Miller extended a hand to Isabella. "Let's see what we can do." While Mrs. Miller took Isabella to the guest room, Edward went to his private study and closed the door. He needed to process the night's events and understand the situation he had put himself in. He called his personal lawyer, Matthew Scott. "Edward?" Matthew's sleepy voice answered after several rings. "It's almost 2 in the morning. What happened?" Edward quickly explained the situation, omitting some details about how he had found Isabella. "I need to know the legal implications of having a vulnerable child in my home." Matthew was silent for a moment. "Edward, this is complicated. If there's a domestic violence investigation, you could be putting yourself in a delicate position, especially with no kinship or official guardianship. The hospital's social worker authorized it. Temporarily. But Edward, you need to understand that getting involved with a child in a high-risk situation can have consequences that go far beyond what you imagine. People might question your motives, especially given your financial standing. Edward felt a chill run down his spine. What are you suggesting? That you be very careful, keep everything documented, transparent, and as soon as possible, transfer responsibility to the proper authorities. After hanging up, Edward sat silently in his leather armchair. The conversation with Matthew had planted a seed of worry. Had he acted on impulse? Was he putting both Isabella and himself at risk? In the guest room, Isabella emerged from the shower wearing one of Edward's t-shirts, which hung down to her ankles like a dress. Mrs. Miller had improvised, rolling up the sleeves and finding a child's belt in a closet to cinch the waist. "Much better," Mrs. Miller said, helping Isabella dry her hair. "Now you look more comfortable." Isabella sat on the king-sized bed, her legs dangling in the air. The room was larger than her entire house with Carmen, with dark wood furniture and an elegant but impersonal decor. "Mrs. Miller," Isabella asked shyly, "is Mr. Edward a good person?" The question took Mrs. Miller by surprise. "Why do you ask that, dear?" "He showed up when I asked for help. But Roberto said some things, said he didn't know anything about our family." Mrs. Miller sat on the edge of the bed. "Mr. Mendoza has been my employer for many years. He's reserved, doesn't talk much about his feelings, but I've never seen him do anything bad to anyone." "Does he live alone?" "Yes, always alone. He works a lot, hardly ever has visitors." Mrs. Miller hesitated, then added, "I think he gets lonely sometimes, even if he won't admit it." Isabella absorbed this information. "I get lonely sometimes too, especially when Roberto is angry and Mommy is sad." Mrs. Miller's heart ached. "You won't have to worry about that anymore, dear. Mr. Mendoza will make sure you two are safe." Just then, Edward's phone rang. It was an unknown number. He answered with some hesitation. "Edward Mendoza." "Well, look who answered." Roberto's drunken voice echoed through the line. The hero of the night. Edward felt the tension immediately. "How did you get my number?" "I have my ways, rich boy. Listen here, you've gotten yourself into something you don't understand. Isabella and Carmen are my family." "Your family?" Edward couldn't contain his sarcasm. "Is this how you treat family? By breaking bones? You don't know anything about our history, about who Carmen really is, about who Isabella really is." Edward remembered Roberto's cryptic words at the house. "Then explain it to me." Roberto laughed bitterly. "Carmen didn't tell you, did she? Of course not. She never tells the whole truth. Isabella isn't just some random kid, Edward. Her father, her real father, is someone you know very well." "What are you talking about? You want to save this family so badly? Then find out who Isabella's father is. When you do, you'll understand why Carmen disappeared from his life. You'll understand why she's been hiding all these years." The line went dead. Roberto had hung up, leaving Edward with more questions than answers. His hands trembled slightly as he processed the implications of Roberto's words. Edward walked to the guest room, where he found Isabella already lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. Mrs. Miller had retired to her quarters. "Can't sleep?" Edward asked softly. Isabella shook her head. "I'm worried about Mommy, and I'm scared that when I wake up, this will all have been a dream." Edward sat in the armchair beside the bed. "It wasn't a dream, Isabella. And your mother is going to be okay." "Mr. Edward," Isabella turned to face him, "did you know my Mommy before tonight?" The question hit Edward like a lightning bolt. "Why do you ask?" "It's just, when I said your name to her in the ambulance, she got this weird look on her face, like she'd heard that name before." Edward felt the world spin. The pieces of a puzzle he didn't even know existed were starting to fall into place. "Isabella, what's your mother's full name?" "Carmen Miller," Isabella answered without hesitation. Miller, the same last name Edward had abandoned when he was adopted by the Mendoza family at 12. The same last name his high school girlfriend had used. Carmen Miller, the 17-year-old girl who had disappeared from his life when he was 18, pregnant with a child he never knew if it was his, Edward was silent for so long that Isabella started to worry. "Mr. Edward, are you okay?" "I'm fine," Edward lied, his voice coming out hoarser than he intended. "You need to rest now." But Edward was not fine. As Isabella finally drifted off to sleep in the king-sized bed, he remained awake. In the armchair, staring at the face of the child he had just discovered might be his daughter, Roberto's words echoed in his mind. "Her real father is someone you know very well." Outside, the rain had stopped, but inside the elegant apartment, a much bigger storm was just beginning. Edward didn't sleep a wink all night. He remained in the armchair in the guest room, watching Isabella sleep, searching her features for any resemblance to himself. Her small upturned nose vaguely reminded him of Carmen as a teenager. Her brown hair had the same unruly texture as his own, but it was her eyes, even closed in sleep, that intrigued him the most. Did they have the same almond shape he saw in the mirror every day? At 6 in the morning, Edward finally got up and went to his own room to shower. His hands trembled as he shaved, and he had to stop 3 times to take a deep breath. In a few hours, he would be face to face with Carmen, and all the questions that had tormented him for 8 years would finally be answered. Isabella woke to the smell of coffee and sweet rolls coming from the kitchen. For a moment, she was confused about where she was, until the reality of the previous night came rushing back. She quickly put on Edward's large t-shirt and went to find him. She found him in the kitchen, speaking in a low voice with Mrs. Miller. They both stopped talking when she appeared, and Isabella sensed they were discussing something serious. "Good morning, Isabella," Edward said, forcing a smile. "Did you sleep well?" Isabella nodded, but her perceptive eyes noticed the dark circles under Edward's. "You didn't sleep, did you?" Edward was surprised by her observation. "How do you know?" "My mommy looks like that when she stays up all night worrying." Isabella sat at the kitchen table, which was larger than the entire dining area of her own home. "Were you worried about me?" The innocence of the question struck Edward deeply. "I was worried about both of you." Mrs. Miller served Isabella milk and toast, cut into star shapes, a sweet attempt to make the girl feel at home. "After breakfast, we'll go to the hospital to see your mum, okay?" Isabella ate silently, but Edward could see the anxiety growing in her eyes. "Mr. Edward," she finally asked, "what if Mommy is in pain? What if she's scared?" Edward sat down next to her. "Your mother is a very strong woman, Isabella. She's going to be fine." "How do you know she's strong?" The innocent question caught Edward off guard. How could he explain that he had known Carmen since she was 17, that he had fallen madly in love with her, that she had disappeared from his life without explanation, taking with her what might be the biggest secret of their lives? "Sometimes you can recognize people's strength just by looking at them," Edward answered carefully. At the hospital, Edward and Isabella walked down the same corridors as the night before, but now with natural light streaming through the windows. Isabella held Edward's hand tightly, her small fingers intertwining with his in a way that felt strangely natural. Dr. Harrison greeted them with a reassuring smile. "Carmen is awake and recovering well. The surgery was a complete success. She's anxious to see Isabella." "Can I speak with her alone first?" Edward asked, his voice thick with a tension he couldn't hide. Isabella looked at him confused. "Why?" "I want to see my mommy." "It'll just be a minute, sweetie. I need to explain to her about last night, about where you slept." Dr. Harrison led Edward to the private room he had arranged. When the door opened, Edward felt as if time had stopped. Carmen was lying in the hospital bed, her left arm immobilized, but she was undeniably the same woman he had loved 8 years ago. She had the same dark hair, now longer, framing a face that had matured but retained its natural beauty. When their eyes met, Carmen turned visibly pale. "Edward," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Carmen." Edward closed the door behind him and slowly approached the bed. "How are you feeling? How did you—" Carmen stopped, shaking her head as if trying to process reality. "How did you show up at my house? How did you know?" Edward told her about the message, about tracing the address, about finding her and Isabella injured. Carmen listened in silence, tears streaming down her face. "Isabella sent the message to you?" Carmen repeated, her voice filled with a complex emotion. "Of all the numbers in the world, she sent it to you." "Carmen," Edward sat in the chair beside the bed, "is Isabella my daughter?" The question hung in the air like a bomb about to detonate. Carmen closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, they were filled with a deep pain. "Yes," she whispered. Edward felt the world spin. Even though he had suspected, hearing the confirmation was like a punch to the gut. "Why did you never tell me? Why did you disappear?" Carmen tried to sit up, but the pain in her arm made her groan. "Edward, you had just been accepted to college in the States. Your adoptive family had invested so much in you, they had so many plans, and that justified hiding my daughter from me." "Hiding her?" Carmen laughed bitterly. "Edward, have you forgotten how our story ended? When I found out I was pregnant, I tried to find you. Your adoptive mother, Mrs. Mendoza, told me you had made it clear you wanted no more contact with me, that I was unsuitable for the future they planned for you." Edward was in shock. "Carmen, that's not true. My mother never told me you tried to contact me. She said you had asked her to keep me away, that I was a distraction, that my family, our social status, didn't fit with their plans for your career." The truth hit Edward like a lightning bolt. Mrs. Mendoza had lied to them both, manipulating the situation to separate them. "Carmen, I never said that. I never knew you were pregnant. If you had known what, Edward? Would you have given up Harvard? Would you have given up all that fortune to stay with me in a rough neighborhood raising a child?" "Yes," Edward yelled, then lowered his voice, remembering where he was. "Yes, Carmen, I would have stayed. I loved you." Carmen cried silently for a few moments. "When Isabella was born, I was alone. I worked 3 jobs to support her. Then I met Roberto, who promised to take care of us. He was good at first, but he became violent." Carmen nodded. "And I became dependent on him, financially, emotionally. It was like I lost myself." Edward took Carmen's good hand. "Carmen, all these years I thought you had left me for another man. I never knew that. That you had a daughter growing up without knowing who her father was." Just then an impatient knock on the door interrupted their conversation. It was Isabella, who had convinced Dr. Harrison to let her come up alone. "Mommy!" Isabella ran to the bed, stopping abruptly when she saw the tears on Carmen's face. "Are you okay? Does it hurt a lot?" "I'm okay, sweetie," Carmen said, quickly drying her tears. "I was just talking to Mr. Edward about last night." Isabella looked between the 2 adults, sensing the tension in the air. "Did you 2 know each other before?" Edward and Carmen exchanged glances. How could they explain such a complex situation to a 7-year-old who had already been through enough trauma? "We knew each other a long time ago," Carmen said carefully. "Before you were born." Isabella processed this information with a child's natural curiosity. "So, you were friends?" "We were. Very close," Edward replied, choosing his words carefully. "And did you have a fight? Is that why you didn't see each other anymore?" The simplicity of the question cut straight to the heart of the matter. Edward looked at Carmen, then at Isabella, and made a decision that would change everything. "Isabella," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "there's something very important we need to tell. You about our family." Carmen tensed. "Edward, don't—" "She has a right to know, Carmen, especially now." Isabella sat on the edge of the bed, her large, attentive eyes fixed on Edward. "What is it, Mr. Edward?" Edward took a deep breath. "Isabella, do you remember always asking about your father?" Isabella nodded slowly. "Well, I'm your father." The silence that followed was absolute. Isabella looked at Edward, then at Carmen, then back at Edward, trying to process the information. "You're my dad?" Her voice was almost a whisper. "Yes." Isabella was silent for a long moment, then asked, "But why weren't you with me when I was little? Why didn't you live with us?" The innocent question cut deeper than any accusation could. Edward knelt beside the bed to be at Isabella's level. "Because I didn't know you existed, sweetie. If I had known, I would have been there from day one. Isabella looked at Carmen. Mommy, why didn't you tell him about me? Carmen closed her eyes, feeling the weight of years of difficult decisions. Because I thought it was for the best, but now I see I was wrong. Isabella looked back at Edward, studying his face, as if seeing it for the first time. So when you got my message yesterday, you came to save your own daughter without knowing it. Edward felt tears burn his eyes. It seems so. Isabella thought for a few more moments, then held out her arms to Edward. As he leaned in to hug her, she whispered in his ear, I always knew my dad would come save me one day. I just didn't know it would be exactly when I needed him most. But outside the room, Roberto was talking to Dr. Cole, planting doubts about Edward Mendoza's true intentions, claiming he knew secrets about the family that would change everything. The intimate moment between Edward, Carmen, and Isabella was interrupted by urgent knocks on the door. Dr. Harrison entered with a worried expression, followed by Dr. Cole and two men Edward didn't recognize. Mr. Mendoza, I need to speak with you, Dr. Cole said, her voice formal and tense. There have been some allegations made against you that we need to clarify. Isabella clung to Edward's arm instinctively, sensing the shift in the room. Carmen tried to sit up straighter in bed, her expression filling with alarm. What kind of allegations? Edward asked, keeping his voice calm despite the rising tension. One of the men identified himself. Detective Mark Stevens, Special Victims Unit. We received a report that you may be taking advantage of a vulnerable situation for questionable purposes. That's ridiculous, Carmen said immediately, her voice gaining strength. Edward saved our lives. He protected us. Mum, what's happening? Isabella asked, her voice small and frightened. Dr. Cole consulted her clipboard. Mr. Roberto Ferreira was here this morning. He alleges that you have a history of inappropriate approaches to vulnerable families, that your sudden generosity hides questionable motives. Edward felt anger rise but controlled it for Isabella's sake. Roberto is the abuser. He broke Carmen's arm. It's natural for him to try to flip the situation. Furthermore, the detective continued, he presented information about your financial status, suggesting you might be trying to buy a family. Isabella looked between the adults, clearly confused and scared. Is Mr. Edward going to have to leave? She asked Carmen. Just then, a familiar voice echoed from the hallway. Where is my granddaughter? Everyone turned to see an elderly woman with white hair and an elegant bearing enter the room. Edward turned, pale as he recognized Mercedes Mendoza, his adoptive mother. Mercedes? Carmen whispered, incredulous. Carmen, my dear. Mercedes approached the bed, completely ignoring the others present. When I heard that Edward had found you two, I had to come immediately. Do you know this woman? Dr. Cole asked. She's my adoptive mother, Edward said, still processing her unexpected presence. Mercedes turned to Isabella with tears in her eyes. You must be Isabella, my granddaughter. Isabella hid behind Edward, intimidated by the imposing presence of the elderly woman. Mercedes, Edward said firmly, what are you doing here? Correcting a mistake I made. 8 years ago, Mercedes replied, her voice thick with emotion. Edward, I need to tell you the truth about Carmen. The detective and Dr. Cole watched the scene with growing confusion, but Mercedes continued, addressing Carmen first. My dear, you must hate me. When you came to me pregnant, saying Edward was the father, I sent you away. I told you Edward wanted nothing to do with you. I know, Carmen said softly. Edward already told me. But there's something you don't know, Mercedes continued, her voice trembling. After you left, Carmen, I was tormented by guilt. I hired a private investigator to keep an eye on you and Isabella over the years. Edward straightened up. What? I knew about Isabella. I knew about Roberto. I knew about the violence. And last night, when my investigator called to tell me Edward had shown up at your house, Mercedes paused, wiping away tears, I realized that fate was correcting my mistakes. You knew? Edward couldn't believe it. All these years you knew I had a daughter, and you didn't tell me. I was wrong, Edward. Completely wrong. I thought I was protecting your career, your future, but I was just feeding my own selfishness." The detective interrupted. "Excuse me, but this doesn't clarify the allegations made by Mr. Ferreira." Mercedes turned to him with the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "Detective, my son Edward Mendoza is one of the most respected businessmen in New York. He doesn't need to buy a family. He has found his own." She took a folder from her elegant handbag. "Here are the reports from the private investigator I hired. 8 years of documentation on the domestic violence Carmen and Isabella suffered. Roberto Ferreira has a history of assault that predates his relationship with Carmen." Dr. Cole took the documents, flipping through them quickly. "These are very detailed reports, and all true," Mercedes affirmed. "Roberto is trying to manipulate the situation because he knows he's lost control over Carmen and Isabella." Carmen addressed the detective. "Sir, I can attest that all Edward did was protect us. Roberto broke my arm. Edward saved us." Isabella, finally understanding that Edward wasn't in danger, stepped out from behind him. "Mr. Edward is my dad," she announced to the entire room. "He came when I asked for help." The detective looked around the room, weighing the evidence and the testimonies. "Mr. Mendoza, I'll need you to come to the station for a formal statement, but based on what I'm seeing here, it seems Mr. Ferreira's allegations are unfounded." "Of course," Edward agreed. "I want everything to be officially cleared up." After the authorities left, Mercedes approached Isabella, who still stood close to Edward. "Isabella," Mercedes said softly, "I know it must be confusing to have a grandmother appear out of nowhere, but I would very much like to get to know you better." Isabella looked at Edward, then at Carmen, seeking approval. "Are you my real grandma?" "I am, dear. And I'm so sorry I wasn't in your life until now." "Mercedes," Carmen said, "thank you for coming. Thank you for bringing the truth." Mercedes approached the bed and took Carmen's good hand. "Carmen, you raised a wonderful girl. Alone, under difficult circumstances. You are stronger than I ever imagined." 2 weeks later, Carmen was recovering in Edward's apartment. Her arm was still in a sling, but the doctors predicted a full recovery. Roberto had been charged with domestic assault and was under a restraining order. Isabella was adapting to her new life with surprising ease. Mrs. Miller had become an almost grandmotherly figure to her, teaching her to bake cookies and telling stories about Edward as a child. The apartment, once cold and impersonal, now had Isabella's drawings on the refrigerator and toys scattered across the living room. "Papa Edward," Isabella called him one afternoon, using the nickname she had created for him. "Can I ask you something?" Edward was working on his laptop in the living room, but closed it immediately upon hearing his daughter's voice. "Of course, sweetie, what do you want to know?" "Why do you live in such a big place if you live all by yourself?" Edward smiled. "Good question. I guess because I didn't know what I really needed." "And now you know?" Edward looked around the apartment, watching Carmen read a book on the sofa, Isabella playing with dolls on the rug, the children's drawings decorating the walls. "Now I know I need a family. And we're your family now?" "You were always my family, Isabella. It just took me a while to find you." That night, after Isabella was asleep, Edward and Carmen sat on the balcony watching the city lights. "Edward," Carmen said softly, "are you sure about all this? Your life has completely changed. You've given up your privacy, your routine." Edward took her hand. "Carmen, for 8 years I built a financial empire, but I lived like an empty man. In one night I found my daughter and the woman I've always loved. I haven't given up anything, I've gained everything." And what if Isabella hadn't typed the wrong number? What if that message had gone to someone else? Edward reflected for a moment. Maybe it wasn't a mistake. Maybe it was the universe giving us a second chance. Carmen rested her head on his shoulder. "Mercedes apologized to me today. She said she wants to help pay for Isabella's college when she grows up." "And what did you say?" "That our daughter will have every opportunity she deserves, but that the most important thing is that she has a family that loves her." 3 months later, Edward, Carmen, and Isabella moved into a house in a quiet residential neighborhood. It was smaller than Edward's apartment, but had a backyard where Isabella could play and a garden that Carmen loved to tend. Mrs. Miller went with them, now officially part of the family. Roberto had been convicted and was serving time. He occasionally sent letters asking for forgiveness, but Carmen had made it clear she wanted no contact. Edward had reorganized his company to work more from home, prioritizing being present for Isabella. His daughter was thriving in her new school, and every night he helped her with her homework, an experience he never imagined would be so fulfilling. One Sunday afternoon, Isabella was playing in the backyard when she ran up to Edward with the new phone he had bought for her. "Papa, Edward, look!" She showed him a message she had typed. "I wrote a message for you." Edward read, "Thank you for saving Mommy and for becoming my real dad. I love you." "Isabella," Edward said, kneeling to her level, "you saved me too. When you sent that message that night, you didn't just save the two of you. You saved our entire family." Isabella smiled and hugged Edward. "So it was a good thing I typed the wrong number, huh?" "It was the best thing you could have ever done," Edward replied, hugging his daughter and feeling that finally he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Carmen appeared at the kitchen door, watching the father and daughter embrace in the garden. Her arm had healed completely, as had her heart. Roberto was now just a painful memory of the past. The future was made of quiet mornings, family lunches, and nights where there was no fear, only love. The message Isabella had sent by mistake on that stormy night had become the foundation of a new life for all of them. A life where a 7-year-old girl could simply be a child, where a woman could love without fear, and where a man discovered that all the wealth in the world was worth nothing compared to the love of a family. And when Isabella looked up at the starry sky before bed, she would whisper a thank you to the universe that had made her cry for help reach exactly the right person, at exactly the right time, changing all of their lives forever.